Good evening, and welcome everyone to your Cannabis Equity Minutes with Cynthia Mompoint on July 2nd, 2021. So this evening, we're going to kick it off with our usual talking about data in Massachusetts. We see that there are a couple more licenses that have become operational. And Twitter is just not happening today, that have become operational. And we are up to 256 businesses that are operating. So again, we're seeing a slower movement than usual in the past, but we are continuing to see a bit of traction. What's even slower though is the number of equity businesses that are opening up, whether it's social equity program participants or economic empowerment certificate holder participants. We're still at, the numbers are 4 and 5, although according to the Cannabis Control Commission, it should be 5 and 5. The website is not necessarily reflective of what they last reported. Something that is interesting is we're seeing a decrease in the number of licensed businesses that are considered medical treatment centers, so that were licensed under that priority status. And in the space of equity, that's concerning to us because we have consistently said that there were businesses that entered our market under the medical priority status that was set aside for the priority status that was set aside for medical businesses and equity businesses. And so we had certain businesses that were operational in Massachusetts, and then the regulatory body expanded what the statute said and said that they were going to include those that were on their way to being operational, and that paved the way for businesses that were well capitalized to pay to play. They paid for the medical license, said that they were going to open up a medical dispensary. They secured host community agreements. They secured property. And in doing so, they were able to secure the priority status. Then they turned around and used that so that they can open up adult use in an expedited fashion. So fast forward to today, where we're looking at 141 operational medical treatment centers, which since I've started the Cannabis Equity Minutes, if you go back a couple of episodes ago, we were looking at 149. So slowly but surely, we see the medical treatment centers are not remaining open, and it's alarming because not only did we highlight that as a violation for equity applicants, because we are competing now not just with the set number of RMDs at the time, but any existing operator who had the capital to come in and pay for that priority status, we were competing with, and not just at the state level to get the priority review, but more importantly at the local level. And that created a significant barrier. It didn't matter if you had had the priority status anymore. At this point, you were competing with big business. You were competing with multi-state operators, which in every industry we're going to see that. The problem is when it came down to regulating this, to ensuring that while we are competing with big business, that there is equity in place, and that did not happen. And so we've since talked about that. I've highlighted that in several communications, even in the outreach to the commission, in the publications that we put out with the observations stemming back in 2020 as to what has happened so far in this industry when it comes to equity and why we're not seeing that. And we're continuing to see the ramifications of the luxuries, if you will, that were extended to businesses without holding them responsible in any way for their weight in and their fair share when it comes to ensuring we have equitable participation. Again, we're not in the business here, or we haven't gotten to that point of saying, well, businesses should not be operational whatsoever. No, they have their licenses, they've contributed their funds, they're erecting their businesses. What we are pushing for is that the regulating bodies, the decision makers, and these businesses as well play a role, play their part in promoting equitable participation. What does that look like? That looks like reviewing applications on a one-to-one basis, the way that it was intended to be. I get what happens when you are in positions of power is you get to exercise discretion on how you interpret the law. And what we've seen in the past, some of the observations that we've made was the fact that the commission exercised that discretion in certain areas and then didn't in other areas. And I think I bring that up because of certain things that are happening in the news currently in our market here in Massachusetts around one of the major multi-state operators who one of their entities put in for a request for a change of ownership at our most recent Cannabis Control Commission, which was approved. And in doing so, there were certain entities and individuals who, on the appearance from anyone looking at it with just the understanding of there's a cap in Massachusetts, you cannot have more than 3 licenses for which you have direct or indirect control. And yet the commission approved that change in ownership. And so now the pushback becomes, okay, hold on a second. You hold our equity participants to such a high standard, but then when it comes to looking at businesses that are well capitalized, I mean, that's the nature of the beast, right? That they have the capital. That's why they're in multi-states. That's why they have these changes in ownerships. They're acquiring certain businesses, and you go through and you start to look at the numerous operations that these businesses are tied to, directly or indirectly. We are encroaching upon, if not surpassing, that cap when we're looking at the retail license or the cultivation licenses. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what is this cap and who is this cap in place for? If there's a discretion that says, well, and whatever the rationale, you can come up with any excuse to justify it. It doesn't make sense. Does it align with the statute and the regulations? No. And what we've called for is that level of boldness, if you will, when it comes to supporting equity program participants in securing businesses and licenses and being able to operate in our industry. And that means we are addressing the key barriers that consistently we've had through research, and you see it across the board with folks who are testifying before various bodies, the key barriers to entry, capital being the first one. Access to being able to secure the host communities being a second one, and then being able to secure properties and dealing with some of the local politics, if you will, or some of the local limitations. And so with that, we've come up with the solution. We said, hey, this is an opportunity that we can address these barriers of entry. We can meet certain requirements, and we can achieve the state mandate. This is something that every stakeholder plays a role in. This is not just on the commission. This is not just on the governing bodies, although what we have found traditionally is that when you have a regulating agency, when you have a body that businesses have to account to in some form or fashion, what is held accountable gets done. So if we hold our businesses accountable to positively impacting our communities in a way that promotes equitable participation, let's be clear, hosting a seminar, I looked at one of the businesses, their positive impact plans, one of these businesses that are tied to I think it's Gotham Green Partners, who's acquired several businesses here in Massachusetts that are operational both in the cultivation and the retail space on the adult use side, in addition to their medical facility. And looking at their positive impact plan, where one is to host educational seminars. Now, what are the benefits for these educational seminars? Their plan is not necessarily clear. It's just to provide information about the industry to people in the community. Does that help our communities understanding that this industry exists? Perhaps. Have we seen this operational with the pandemic and the shift in the way business is done, the shift in the way information is disseminated? That hard answer to that is no. We haven't seen notable impact in that area. But it's alarming because these businesses are obviously in a position where they could leverage, whether it's their licenses that they have that are over the limit, the facilities that they've secured that most likely meet the local bylaws and zoning regulations, or the host, and even further, the host community agreements, that they turn those over, and that there be an expectation from the governing bodies that these would be utilized by equity program participants. But again, you see, there's a role that every player has. And I think even when we look at the program participants, those who are vocal in the space in advocating or activism, whatever the phrase you want to use, on speaking on behalf of equity participation, equity program participants, you see the interests come from different angles, right? There's some who take a hard stance on and looking at this from a business standpoint, and then there are others who take a more social justice stance, if you will, and look at it strictly from the vantage point of, we want to see movement, and without disregard for any of the structures in place. And I think each of these approaches have a role in our industry. However, what we're seeing is, instead of that, these approaches targeting those who are benefiting, those who are progressing and enjoying, if you will, the opportunity that has been afforded in Massachusetts through legalization, we see more of a conflict at that level amongst the activists as to what should be happening, where what we're saying here is both can take place. And we see that. We see that with certain businesses that are operational, that are equity businesses, or that have placed such a vested interest in equity businesses through their contracting, through their hiring, through their business dealings, that you see where the priorities are. And while we're looking for the commission who has identified and said that they would be identifying social justice leaders, it's important that we're clear on where are we staking this hold in terms of leadership in this space. Implementing the PIES program, and we see businesses, I see the businesses that are out there doing a version of the PIES. Perhaps they're not calling it PIES, but doing their version where they have sponsored, if you will, or paired up with an equity participant and said, hey, look, we will assist you in securing the various needs that you have to secure: the business, the location, your business professional resources, your host community agreement, and then even submitting your application to the commission to ensure that you are successful. So to say that this isn't a viable model is a misconception in the community. We see it happening. We see it happening. What we're saying is allow these businesses to do it in a structured way. And the businesses that aren't doing it, hold them accountable, because if these smaller entities can do it, then for sure we should be expecting with these positive impact plans, a level of structure that's commensurate with the types of revenue You're talking about businesses that have 70, 80, 90,000 um, square feet of canopy where they're producing flower. Then they turn around and they have a production manufacturing facility, 3 retail outlets, and they have agreements with other businesses for their products that they are producing. They have a heavy footprint in our market. And to look and see positive impact plans of donating $5,000 to a training program or hosting certain webinars or information classes, which, if you are familiar with the equity program in Massachusetts, these resources are provided to equity participants. The commission offers technical assistance, and they have updated. If you look at the with the third cohort application, which is now available on the commission's website, it will be available. From my understanding, has not changed. It's going to be available up until September. Now, if you are an economic empowerment certificate holder who does not qualify for the social equity program participation aspect as it stands with the current guidelines, go back and revisit that. They have made an update to the third cohort and for the social equity program, and said that they would open up to economic empowerment certificate holders if you meet one of I think they identified 3 criterias. So loop back if you are a certificate holder and interested in the social equity program benefits of having access to technical assistance and training. Loop back there, check it out. You may qualify for that. Now, again, we have not commented on the effectiveness of the trainings. I think the data in and of itself speaks for itself. There's only so much that training can do, and the commission has seen turnover in terms of the training that's offering, and the caliber of the training varies depending on the track and programming that you are a part of. And then even after that, depending on who's running those trainings and the access to resources that they have and who they choose to share or tap into to provide those resources, they do vary, but there is something in place. The commission has that in place. And so again, we go back to these positive impact plans, and we ask that the regulatory body push a little bit more, that in the same vein that they have expectations around security, in the same vein that they have expectations around product labeling, excuse me, in the same vein that they have expectations around diversity. So much so that if you read some of the revised plans that these applicants submit, they put the caveat that we revised our plan to meet the diversity goal or expectation of the commission, and we will work hard to reach that. As almost to say a caveat, but hey, look, that wasn't the goal that we set. The commission set that without understanding some of the local, if you will, the local demographics that would impact who they're able to tap into. And so when we talk about the PIES program, and we talk about something that's very structured, and I constantly hear pushback from businesses, pushback from individuals on certain challenges that they're facing in meeting requirements. And I just, it boggles the mind, because I say, well, the issues that I constantly see are addressed by having the PIES program. And one of the things that I do not highlight when I give this overview is the fact that it's not something that the agency itself would necessarily regulate. It would make sense to have a third party provide that service to regulate the relationships. And when we say regulate the relationships, this is something that is happening over a time period of 5 years, or 4 to 5 years. And there are benchmarks that need to be met in order to say that this relationship is successful and moving forward, and to ensure that if the equity participant has entered into this relationship with the understanding and the expectation that they're holding and maintaining 100% ownership of their business, that's not compromised, right? That there aren't some type of, that they don't fall prey, if you will, to contracts or loan agreements or any other agreements that have fine print which would cause that equity participant to lose control, whether it's direct or indirect control of their business. All of these elements are accounted for. And the hopes is, as the community starts to realize, it's going to be one individual here, one individual there, until we get something that's systematic and systemic. In the same vein, in the same way that we saw the entrance into our industry and the control, if you will, the heist of our priority status by these businesses that were well capitalized and well connected. It was systematic, and we have talked about that in terms of from the way our regulations, our statutes were set up, to the key players who facilitated the licensing and the acquisition of host community agreements and submission of applications to the Cannabis Control Commission, to the very regulating body. And we spent quite a bit of time recently looking at the role of the social justice chair to truly step up and speak up on behalf of equity program participants. But there were other actors at the commission, and I go back to when the commission's general counsel, Counsel Bailey, had the opportunity to make certain key decisions that would impact equity in our industry, and without giving much information as to why she made the decisions that she made. Particularly, I'm thinking about the decision around the one-to-one priority and how to understand what the statute says and interpret that without providing any context other than that's the direction that the commission's going to take. And then you fast forward to some of the other decisions that the commission has made, and I won't belabor that point because you can go to some of the other minutes where I've shared some of the things that we see these decisions. And this is why I say the regulatory body plays a significant role, but not the only role in effectuating equity in our market. But they play the role of accountability, they play the role of transparency, and if they choose to not exercise that authority, then it makes the rest of the lift, if you will, an uphill battle, because now it becomes an issue of each individual entity, existing operator, existing establishment that has a large footprint in our market. Why should they go above and beyond the bare minimum for corporate social responsibility? Well, what is the incentive outside of that? Whereas this is where it becomes this shift amongst even the community in terms of how do we approach the various entities and say, hey, is it that we want these entities to hold their weight in terms of their social responsibility in our market, or do we simply want this to be a government-led, government-sponsored, government-funded, government issue without any responsibility on the rest of the community? I think if we want to see the cannabis industry not be business as usual, then we have to say every stakeholder has a responsibility. If not, it's going to be business as usual. We're going to see the same things that we see in other industries. When you look at the liquor industry, when you look at the numbers in in any other business industry, the real estate industry, any of these other industries that we have erected, and we look at who has access, who is participating in various capacities. When we talk about home ownership and any of these sectors where we're talking about the systemic culture, the systems of white supremacy that operate throughout all of our systems, if we don't want to see business as usual, then we need to change that business as usual. And that means the onus is not just on the government, but on all stakeholders. And the government, in this case, the regulating body, has to hold these businesses accountable. If they don't, then they have what they take the stance that they've taken now, which is this loophole of, well, these barriers exist and there's only so much that we can do around these barriers. And I call it a loophole because so long as the regulating body says they can't do anything, then, and they're not holding the businesses accountable, the businesses will then say, well, there's no incentive, there's no reason, and they won't come out and say it that way, right? It shows in the actions, it shows in the outcomes. And then we do have certain businesses with the intention of taking corporate social responsibility to heart and demonstrating their commitment to effectuating equity in our industry and promoting equitable participation in a lot of different ways. And then all businesses will turn around and say, hey, well, we have done the positive impact plan. We have submitted it to the commission. The commission has accepted it. They've renewed our licenses. So obviously what we're doing is acceptable. But what we're saying here and what we're pushing with these equity minutes, as we're looking at Massachusetts, the first in the nation to legislate equity. Massachusetts, the state that has the vehicles in place to push equitable participation and meet that legislative mandate. And to see that we don't even have limits in terms of the number of licenses, where we see that in other states. So the opportunity to say, hey, look, we want to see this type of, that we want to see businesses coming in, operating and opening up, and then positively impacting in this structured manner. It's like in the classroom or in a lot of other sectors where it's not even just in the classroom, but when you're doing forms of evaluation, you have what's called a rubric, if you will, and it is a standard that you utilize. And presumably the commission has this, because when you submit your application, they have a standard, what they're looking for. And if you are submitting an application for, whatever license, if you're submitting an application for a delivery license versus if you're submitting an application for a cultivation license, the requirements aren't going to be the same. So you have this rubric which has the checklist of, okay, if it falls under this category, then these are the requirements that you have. This is what we want to see. So you're not going to see expectations around vehicles having 2 cameras and a safety box, etc. If someone's submitting an application for a cultivation license, it's just not, it doesn't apply. And so in that same vein, when you look at the positive impact plan and you see a company is up for renewal, and you see the information that they've submitted, and they're operating 3, 4, 5, 6 licenses in our state, and then you look at the positive impact plan and they are at the level of donating to charity, and you're just like, wait a minute, that's not and you compare that to, we're looking at some of our equity program participants, and they've committed to supporting an equity business, and you consider the lift to that, and you're saying that both of these businesses are reaching their positive impact plan requirements. That's not acceptable, especially when you have reason and rationale to back your decision for holding businesses to the same standard. I guess a more closely related example would be to say, the tax revenue that they're generating. You're not going to expect the smaller business to be paying the same amount of taxes as a business that has numerous operations in our state. Not at all. And perhaps someone get into logistics around some of the write-offs that they are able to. And I'm not getting into 280E and all of that, just kind of looking at this big picture and why it is, if we want to see this needle move, because we're going to see more general applicants coming in, we're going to see more businesses that are continuing to operate. We're going to see a slower progression in the number of businesses that are getting to this point of operational, not just securing the license, because we see there are a significant number of businesses that have secured their provisional license and they're at the point of, okay, well, I need the capital. Even businesses that are extending to work with equity program participants, but the call is, hey, you need to come, you need to get capital. You need to get your facility. You need you need a location. And so if there were a way to streamline all of that, we will see the types of outcomes that we want. And so the call, I guess, then is to our local activists, our community members who are very vocal and looking and who care about equity in this space. You know, that's not a priority for everyone, but for those who are proponents and they tout that rhetoric that they care about equity in this space, well, let's look at equity and outcomes, because just looking at it from the standpoint of equity and opportunity, the commission is going to say, hey, we've extended the opportunity, and this is exactly what happened when that decision was made by the commission in 2018 and then further in 2019. And they said, well, the opportunity is there for economic empowerment certificate holders to exercise priority. And so they didn't. We've done our part. And that wasn't true, because the decisions could have been made in a way that in order for us to demonstrate priority, we need to see that one-to-one. And so if we don't have enough a pool to exercise true priority and demonstrate true priority, then we need to go back to the pool and address that. And if even in the pool, we're not able to get them to operational, we need to find out, what do we do to make sure that the outcome is going to demonstrate equitable participation. And if we're not looking at outcomes, then you're not talking about equity. You're talking about pushing rhetoric so that we can say, hey, we pushed for social equity. And this is where that loophole comes in, because we know the barriers already. And if we just look at the opportunity and not provide the resources and the all of the elements in place to ensure that that opportunity translates to outcome, then we were never really about equity. So I say all that, again, really just highlighting, I presume the commission, they may or may not come out a little bit more in explaining how it is that they're able to exercise discretion when it comes to looking at some of our well-capitalized businesses, but then when it comes to really pushing the needle for us, and holding businesses accountable with positive impact plans, looking at the PIES program as a viable option for our industry, looking at how they can maximize the efforts of the current technical assistance that we're receiving, looking at how they maximize the current vehicles that we have, maximizing their commitment to equity. Until we see that, we're going to have to push back and say, do we really want equitable outcomes, or are we content with the opportunity existing in writing and folks arguing back and forth as to, well, we don't have this and we can't do this? Are we content with that? Or are we going to push the needle, put the pressure where it needs to be so that we can start to see equitable outcomes? Because we see what happens when we have equitable outcomes. We're going to start to see then there's more conversation in terms of access in all facets. You look at some of these businesses committed to equity, and you look at their diversity and their hiring and their contracts, and you're like, well, it's across the board. It is consistent across the board. And this is without even being held accountable. But what it shows us is that it can be done. And if it's not about the business of erecting, maintaining, and pushing the status quo, then we're going to see these conversations. And in the same vein that on the opportunity aspect of it, everyone benefits. When you push for equitable participation, looking at equity through an outcome lens, everyone still benefits. So you've heard me say, white women, white veterans, and how they are the ones that are benefiting. That doesn't stop. It doesn't change because they are part of our social equity program. So we're going to continue to see them benefit. And it's not an indictment at this point. It never was. It never has been. What it is, though, is where do we see our key stakeholders and decision makers holding themselves accountable for maximizing their responsibility to ensure that those who have traditionally been marginalized, and now we're seeing traditionally marginalized the most, if you will, have the opportunity to enter into this space. On that note, so I've covered the data, I've covered the change and the shift that we're seeing in the number of medical treatment centers that are operational, and that is not necessarily increasing. And perhaps we will see medical treatment centers operational, that number increase when we see the commission commit to opening up the benefits for pursuing that type of license to equity program participants, and also removing some of the barriers. And I know, again, part of that, they've handed that decision over to the Cannabis Policy, the legislative body, and the Cannabis Policy Committee is currently accepting comment on that. I believe the comment period is soon fast approaching, closing up on that particular aspect when it comes to the medical marijuana licenses and the opportunities that are available for equity program participants. And so perhaps in the future, we will see that shift. But as it stands right now, what we said was going to happen is happening, and that is we're not seeing as many medical treatment centers and their access and availability growing, despite the number of licenses that were secured under that. And then we're seeing the continuation of benefits and accommodations, is the term that I used in the marijuana social equity report. Accommodations being made for some of our well-capitalized businesses, when we should see that accommodations being made for equity participants and accountability being held for our existing operators with the large footprint here in our industry. So to that end, I will wrap that up, and I think I would be amiss if I didn't just highlight some of the things happening on the international front when it comes to cannabis with Sha'Carri Richardson. I think everyone has, if you're in the cannabis community, has some awareness of the fact that she has been recently testing positive for marijuana, for cannabis in her system. And while this isn't necessarily, this is a cannabis community issue, right? It's an issue because we are dealing with the stigma of the plant. We are dealing with misinformation around the plant. And then we're dealing it here. It is on the international front. And we have a young woman who happens to be Black, who is probably the fastest runner in the world at this moment. She had a world record breaking run for qualifying, and just poised to do amazing things, and was ready to go to Tokyo. And I think there is an opportunity for discretion to be exercised as to whether or not they will not hold that test against her and allow her to test again. The Olympics, I think we have another 3 weeks before it starts. And so what we're dealing with in our industry here is a microcosm of what's happening on a macro level in a lot of capacities. This discretion aspect of it is an area where some may argue that we will see, will she be treated in the same vein had she not been a woman of color. And I say both of those things um, because, and I'm not going to go into Michael Phelps. I don't think Michael Phelps, we know enough about his situation to say his situation is comparable or not comparable. And why do I say we don't know enough? His situation came and he suffered backlash after the fact. And the market, the nature of cannabis, both here in in our country and even on a global scale, is much different than it was back then. And we don't know if there were any type of testing that were done where there were accommodations made for him, because we don't know if that was investigated back then. And so I think I'd be amiss to quell that perspective. I'm not pushing that in any way, shape, or form. But even here on Cannabis Equity Minutes, we are rooting for Sha'Carri Richardson to have the opportunity to represent the United States in Tokyo, and in hopes that it sends a message across the globe that we definitely need to have a reality check on where cannabis stands um, as a plant versus a drug, because there are other substances. If they tested for them, people would test positive for them, for those substances, but they aren't tested for those substances because they're not considered an illegal drug, or a drug of enhancement that they're looking out for. So the hopes is that cannabis will soon be taken off that list. And so that is in the sports arena. We do see that happening here in the States when we look at the NBA and the NFL and their move to not look at marijuana testing, but we're looking at the international arena. So it's a whole different ball game. And so we'll watch to see, and in hopes that there will be some type, in the discretion of the judges, and considering the light of the role cannabis is playing throughout the world right now, and the changes that are happening, that she won't be penalized for it. But if she is penalized for it, there are a lot that here back in the States we can continue to support her, particularly businesses, and sponsor her sponsorship and so forth. So we'll wait to see what happens, and we'll comment then. But for now, we're rooting for her, and we'll see how that plays out. On that note, yeah, we have a lot to look out for. We will tune in next week on Tuesday. Thank you for those of you who have chimed in, those of you who continue to support and check in on what we have to say when it comes to equity here in Massachusetts, and equity, I guess at this point across the globe, right? But across the nation, and what the measures that are happening. There are some things that are moving. They just haven't moved enough for us to say that they're doing anything in the space of equity. There's a lot of rhetoric. Again, we have to always ground our assessment in the outcome, or the potential outcome, and the timeline for that outcome. So if we can have immediate changes, and someone's telling us, oh, well, wait, because if we do it this way, then we, are going to guarantee X, Y, Z, and they provide whatever excuse. I'm not really about the business of waiting. I think we've waited for far too long, if you consider the ramifications that we have dealt with the war on drugs in the last 50 years. And in our particular instance here in Massachusetts, so we've been waiting 3, 4, 5 years now. And so how much longer should we wait to be able to enjoy what was promised us, both in legislation and even in the spirit of the reason why we had legalization and the push for it? On that note, I will say have a wonderful evening. Thank you, and see you on Tuesday. End of the stream here.